It was shortly before midnight on May 26, 1867, when Princess Victoria Mary of Teck was born at Kensington Palace. She was the first child and only daughter of her parents, Francis, the Duke of Teck, and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge. Her father was of rather minor German nobility, while her mother was a granddaughter of King George III. Princess Mary Adelaide, or simply Mary as she was called by her family, was born in 1833, with her father being Prince Adolphus, the Duke of Cambridge. Mary herself was therefore quite high up in the line of succession at the time of her birth. But lastly, her first cousin, famous Queen Victoria, would ascend to the British throne in 1837. The two cousins would share an upright relationship and would frequently exchange letters. When Mary grew into a young adult, her future husband became widely discussed, as she was at last a granddaughter of late King George III. But despite receiving a marriage proposal from the King of Sardinia, Mary was not interested in marrying, as she did not want to leave her home country. Next, there was the problem that just not as many suitable men were interested in Mary. As Queen Victoria would write, "Her size is fearful, it is really a misfortune." And so when in 1866 Mary accepted the marriage offer of the Duke of Teck, her whole family breathed a huge sigh of release. Just 2 months earlier, Queen Victoria wrote in her diary, "Mary is looking old and not thinner." Only 4 months after this offensive comment and 2 months after the engagement, Mary married Francis. But who was Francis? The man that was, you could almost say, willing to marry Mary Adelaide and even move to the UK, for she did not wish to leave the country. Francis was born in 1837, so he was 4 years younger than his future bride. He was the son of Duke Alexander of Württemberg, the heir apparent to the King of Württemberg. But when Duke Alexander decided to marry Countess Rede de Kisrede, a Hungarian countess, he was forced to give up his place in the line of succession. Francis's mother's heritage would once again raise voices when it became clear that he would marry a British princess. King Leopold of the Belgians, for example, could not help himself than to point it out to his niece, Queen Victoria, that Francis was not of equal rank. But the Queen had one sharp response for her uncle. "I have always thought it and do think it is very wrong and very absurd that because his mother was not a princess, he could not succeed in Württemberg." The wedding, which took place on June 12, 1866, was overshadowed by the nearer coming outbreak of the Austro-Prussian War. This would come to reality only 2 days later. Francis, who had long served in the Austrian army, joined back in for the 2 months the war lasted, thus cutting short his and Mary's honeymoon. In 1867, the by then pregnant Mary and Francis settled into their rooms at Kensington Palace, which were given to them by Queen Victoria. And with this we reach the point where our story first started off. The arrival of Mary and Francis's first child, Mary, born exactly on her due date and in the same room her future grandmother-in-law was born in, Mary was the first child to her parents. A year later, her brother Adolphus was born. In 1870 and 1874, 2 more brothers followed. With Mary being the eldest and only daughter, this would be the foundation for her later discretion and firmness. From a young age on, Mary was known as the peacemaker within her family. Later in life, Mary would become known for preserving her family's history. She would buy back pieces from her family's collection which had been long sold off to private people with her own money. Mary inherited this trait from her mother, who was well aware that she herself was a granddaughter of famous King George III. In later years, Mary would not talk much about her youth. What we know is that her family's lack of wealth forced them to move abroad in 1883. After a journey through Switzerland, they settled in Florence, Italy, in a hotel named Paulis. There, Mary followed her interest in art and literature, but she never really became cozy in Italy. The move to Florence also brought a turning point to Mary's education. Namely, she began studying foreign literature. This sparked her lifelong love of reading. Eventually, the family would move back to London in 1885. A year after arriving back in London, Mary, or May as she was called within the family, was introduced to court in her debut. In August 1891, we find the first mentioning of Princess Mary as a suitable bride for Prince Albert Victor, the son of Edward, the Prince of Wales, and second in line to the British throne. Mary was considered an excellent bride as she was the only unmarried British princess which did not descend from Queen Victoria. This would bring fresh blood into the family. On December 3, 1891, Prince Albert Victor proposed to Princess Mary and she accepted his proposal. The wedding date was already set for the 27th of February of the following year as Queen Victoria hated long periods of engagements when Albert Victor suddenly fell ill. Goodbye, 1891. A most eventful year to me, wrote Princess Mary to her diary without knowing what would come next. While out shooting on January 7, 1892, Prince Albert Victor felt unwell. The prince went to bed with Mary by his side. The next day was his birthday, but it became clear that this was not only a cold he was suffering from, it was influenza. Albert Victor only had the power to walk down to look at his presents before returning to bed. The next day, Albert Victor had developed inflammation in the lungs. By the 13th of January, he was in a delirious state. Almost the whole family gathered in his small bedroom, his mother bravely holding his hand. But at 9:35 a.m. on the morning of January 14, 1892, Prince Albert Victor died. Queen Victoria, Albert's parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, Mary, and the whole nation were shocked by the sudden death. Shortly after the funeral, everybody seemed to have the same idea. May must marry George. George was Prince Albert Victor's younger brother, who had now taken his deceased brother's place in the line of succession. And so on the day Mary should have married Albert Victor, her family took her to Compton Palace. There she got closer to Prince George, playing card games and going shopping. Nevertheless, Mary wrote into her diary on that day, "Chilly damp day. This day is a very sad one for me. It was to have been our wedding day." 1892 went by without any engagement, and the speculation within the family and from the press rose. And then finally, in May 1893, while on a walk outside, George proposed to Mary and she accepted. The wedding followed on July 6th of that same year, whereafter the newlyweds settled at York Cottage. Soon after, Mary was pregnant and the baby was expected to arrive in mid-June of 1894. As June came by, the entire family was eagerly awaiting the news of the arrival of a royal baby, and finally, on June 23, 1894, at 10 in the evening, Edward was born. Over the next 10 years, 5 more children would follow. Tragedy struck Mary when in late 1897 her mother, the Duchess of Teck, passed away after an emergency operation. Only 2.5 years later, Mary's father also passed away. A year and 1 day later, Queen Victoria was dying. Mary and George made it to Osborne House just in time to be with the Queen during her last hours of life. Mary recalled in her diary, "The Queen looked so beautiful after death, like a marble statue and much younger." George and Mary now automatically became Duke and Duchess of Cornwall. It was not until November of that year that they were granted the famous titles Prince and Princess of Wales. They had spent the majority of 1901 visiting the British Empire. In 1905, after the birth of their last child, George and Mary undertook an extensive tour through India, leaving their children in the care of their grandparents. Upon the death of her father-in-law in May 1910, Mary became Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. As such, Mary and George agreed that Mary, whose first name in fact was Victoria, should be known as Queen Mary. The new king and queen found the weeks that followed after their ascension to the throne nerve-wracking. To make things worse, Mary now had to deal with her now widowed mother-in-law who thought of herself to be more superior to her. In the summer of 1914, the First World War broke out, and you can find the following entries in Mary's diary. Very wet day. Set to work to make plans to help the existing organizations with offers of clothing and money. At the beginning, everybody was sure that this war would be a short and easy victory. But as we know how history went, World War I would be one of the deadliest wars ever fought. When the war ended in 1918, the United Kingdom came out successfully. A crowd gathered in front of Buckingham Palace to cheer to the same king and queen they did when the war first started. Only 2 months after the end of the war, Mary and George's youngest child, Prince John, died after suffering from epilepsy his whole life. Mary received the news from John's nanny and had to inform George. The shocked parents immediately made their way to John. During the second half of George V's reign, Mary would continue to support her husband with all of his duties. She used her deep knowledge of history and royalty to advise her husband on difficult decisions and always radiated peace. During these years, George V became increasingly ill. This most likely leads back to his lifelong smoking. For example, in the winter of 1928, George V fell dangerously ill after a house party at Sandringham. Queen Mary was getting anxious when George's heart began to get weaker by December. Rumors even began to spread that the king was dead. George did not die, but he was close to death. By Christmas 1928, King George V was strong enough to give Mary her present, a pink topaz and a diamond pendant. This ill health of King George V would continue throughout his next few years. Lastly, George entered 1936 in bad health. The king died on January 20th, 1936, with his beloved wife by his side. Mary wrote 2 words in her diary: "Am heartbroken." Mary lived through the abdication crisis of 1936, in which her eldest son, then Edward VIII, abdicated the throne, making his younger brother, George, now king. In 1939, she witnessed the outbreak of the Second World War, which forced her to leave London for Babington House in Gloucestershire. What she would not yet know is that she would be resident there for the next 6 years. The 25th of August 1942 was a rainy day. Mary was doing her needlework when a message came through that her youngest surviving son had died in a plane crash. Mary wrote in her diary, "I felt so stunned by the shock, I could not believe it." On June 11, 1945, Mary was able to return to London. There, Mary would spend her last years in relatively robust health. In November of 1948, she was delighted at the birth of future Charles III, who made her a great-grandmother. In her last few years, Mary suffered from rheumatism and at times required a wheelchair. On February 6, 1952, Mary was staying at Marlborough House when at 9:30 a.m. her woman of the bedchamber knocked at the door. The woman, Lady Cynthia Colville, brought to her the last burden Mary could carry. She had been informed that her son and king was found dead this morning. Mary would never recover from this last shock. Queen Mary would spend her last year of life with the same passion she always had: art and history. On the evening of March 24, 1953, Queen Mary died at the age of 85.